Hey, this is Mrs. Weefy, and in this video we are going to discuss evolution by way of descent with modification as Charles Darwin had introduced to us. Now, there were three broad observations of life that Darwin developed explanations for, and those are that organisms are suited for life in their environments, that they shared characteristics of life, and this led to a rich diversity of life. And so we're going to overall take a look at how this came about with Charles Darwin's studies. So evolution can be defined in two different ways. One is descent with modification, which Darwin explained as Earth's many species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from present-day species. And that is just a textbook definition of descent with modification. Basically, today's species look different from way back in the ancestral species. The second definition is that evolution is a change in the genetic composition or the gene pool of a population over time. Now, two key things here. Population. Population is the smallest unit of organisms that can evolve. An individual cannot evolve, but it is a population that evolves. And the other key thing is over time. So it takes generations to see that change in the gene pool. Evolution can also be viewed in two different ways. It can be viewed as a pattern of change, which is determined from lots and lots of data or observations that scientists collect over time. Or it can be viewed as a process which explains the pattern of change, in other words, the mechanism behind that change. And that is what Darwin tried to introduce to us, or did introduce to us, and what we study from one biology class to another. So we have Charles Darwin, who traveled on the HMS Beagle and had very many influences from other scientists. He collected specimens, he made observations, he witnessed earth-altering events like an earthquake when exploring in Chile, and he put all of these observations together. And one thing that he noticed was that adaptations allowed organisms to survive in their environments. And so he questioned, if a new species could develop from the gradual adaptations to different environments. And this was like the big question that he answered, and that is what really became the basis for his theory of evolution by descent with modification. Let's take a look at an example of what we mean by that. This is a fossil of what is the stickleback fish. Now, the stickleback fish is found in two different environments, a marine environment and also in a freshwater environment. Notice the top one that we have right here. That top one has spines, okay, both at the top and the bottom. And if we actually saw the fish, you would see it would have like a coat of armor. But the function of those spines in the marine environment is that when a predator would come close, it would flare up its spines and kind of scare away the predator. However, if you look at this bottom one right here, you'll notice that the spines are missing. Well, this is the stickleback variation that is found in freshwater environments. Now, the interesting thing about the sticklebacks is that they migrate very much like the salmon do. They migrate from a marine environment to a freshwater environment to spawn. And with the melting of the glaciers and the formation of more lakes, the scientists are finding fossil evidence of sticklebacks that don't have these spines. So what happens is, so you have these two adaptations, one with spines and one without spines. In the freshwater environment, if the stickleback with spines, they would get caught up on the vegetation and the rocks and kind of expose them to the predators, and boom, there they go. But the adaptation with no spines, those fish were able to survive, reproduce, and proliferate in their environment. And so how did they lose their spines? They couldn't just fall off. And so what Darwin did, he explained this as the mechanism behind these adaptations as being natural selection, which are those individuals that inherit traits or adaptations to allow them to survive and reproduce in their specific environment will gradually proliferate in that environment. And that just kind of makes sense. Now, he went on to explain how natural selection occurs. So this is the mechanism behind the evolution, natural selection. And so to make people understand this, he compared this to what humans have been doing for quite a number of years, and that is artificial selection. So for instance, let's say you have pea pods. You have pea pods where you would have 3 to 4 peas in a pod. You would have pea pods that would have 6 to 7 in a pod. Well, farmers would want the pea plants that would produce, the maximum number of peas. And so, in agriculture, we would breed for those plants that produce the maximum number of peas. That's artificial selection. So he explained this first by making observations, and then he made inferences to explain the mechanism by which populations evolve over time. So these are the observations that he made. That there has to be variation within a population. If we take a look at the classic example, the peppered moth, you have 2 variations. We have the light-colored and we have the dark-colored. Well, the light-colored moths would survive on where they would hang out on trees that have light-colored trunks. So the black ones would stick out, birds would come down, pick them off, use them for their food. But during the Industrial Revolution, where you had a lot of soot being released from the factories, these trees became covered with soot, so they were darkened, and now the variation that did not survive in the population would be the light-colored ones, and the black-colored moth population began to grow. The other thing that he noticed is that all species can reproduce more than the environment can support. So these moths, they're going to produce a lot of little baby moths that have both of these, that have the 2 different variations. But the variation that's going to survive is the one that is specifically adapted to its environment. Now he made inferences from these observations and concluded that those individuals with the more favorable variation has a higher probability for survival, and that since these individuals with the more favorable traits are more likely to survive and reproduce, then that favorable trait will accumulate in the population over time. Now, their evolution is supported by scientific evidence, and we have 4 types of data that documents the pattern of evolution. One is by direct observation. So if we take a look at this example here, the soapberry bug, the soapberry bug feeds off of the seeds of the fruit of a balloon vine. The balloon vine is very specific to southern Florida. So the fruit is kind of like a nice big puffball. It's nice and plump. And so the soapberry bug, you can see it like right here, has a very long beak so that it can insert that beak into the fruit and pull out the seeds. So it feeds on the seeds. So those soapberry bugs with short beaks aren't able to really survive on the balloon vine fruit in southern Florida. Now in central Florida, we take a look down here. Central Florida, the balloon vine tree is very, very rare. But there is an invasive tree, the golden rain tree from Asia, was introduced to central Florida. Now its fruit has flat lobes on it, so the seeds are very close to the surface. So the soapberry bug with the short beak is able to feed off of those seeds. So in central Florida, the soapberry bugs with the short beaks are very prominent compared to southern Florida, where they're not able to feed off of the balloon vine fruit. Now, the second type of evidence is homology. And homology is the similarity in organisms based on common ancestry. Now, we have some anatomical homologies right here. So we're looking at the anatomical structure of these different mammals right here. They all have the same kind of bones in their forelimbs. However, the function of those forelimbs is very, very different. Now, they're related because they share these anatomical homologies. Now, you can also have anatomical homologies in embryos, as we see here between the chick and the human. They both have pharyngeal arches, they both have a postanal tail, but as they develop, those structures can develop into different things. But because they both possess them in the embryo, then they are thought to have a remote common ancestor. Now, we have to be careful about analogous structures and convergent evolution. Sometimes organisms look very similar, like we have the flying squirrel and the sugar glider, but they evolved independently, which is called convergent evolution, when they have different lineage, but they adapt to similar environments. So we notice that the flying squirrel is located in North America. It is called a eutherian. It fully develops in the mother's uterus. Now, analogous to the flying squirrel is the sugar glider, which is found in Australia. Very similar environment. However, it is a marsupial in which it completes its development outside of the mother's uterus. So it has not evolved from a common ancestor. Now, we also have fossil records. DNA sequences show that living cetaceans include whales, dolphins, and porpoises, are closely related to even-toed ungulates. Well, even-toed ungulates include deer and pig. So how is it that, the living cetaceans can be related to even-toed ungulates? Well, fossil record shows that an early ancestor of the cetaceans, Pakicetus, and this is a picture diagram here of the Pakicetus here, you can see it has 4 legs, where the living cetaceans do not, but they are related to one another. Well, the Pakicetus and the ankle bone, these are fossils of the ankle bone, has 4 lobes, just like the even-toed ungulates have 4 lobes on its ankle bones. In addition to, if we take a look, the even-toed ungulates, like the hippopotamus, has this pelvic bone right here, and the pelvic bone is also found in the living cetaceans, so we can make a connection between the living cetaceans and the even-toed ungulates through fossil record. Okay, now lastly we have biogeography. Biogeography is the study of geographic distribution of species that was influenced by continental drift. So back 250 million years ago, the world was considered to be one big continent, which we called Pangaea. About 200 million years ago, the continents started to drift apart. And so if you had organisms, that lived close together, and now, you had some that were separated, that formed their own little colony or population of species and adapted to their specific environment. Through biogeography, we can predict where the fossils of these different groups might be found. We can predict the ages of the fossils, and we can predict the origin of the common ancestor, and use all of this to understand the evolution of the species. Okay, so that is my video on the basics of natural selection through descent with modification. This is Mrs. Wheathy. Goodbye for now.